Welcome, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Thomas Philippon. I'm the Max Heiner Professor of Finance at New York University, and we are delighted today to continue the Stigler Center's Economic Effects of COVID-19 workshop series. And today we have Eric Budish and Luigi Zingales. So before we start, let me highlight that the session itself, the two presentations are going to be recorded. So the two talks are going to be recorded. However, the Q&A section at the end, the last 30 minutes are going to be off the record. So please hold off questions until the Q&A portion. And then you can submit your questions via the Q&A button on Zoom, or you can raise your hand and I will moderate the questions. So before we begin, let me just briefly introduce the presenters, even though they don't really need an introduction. So Eric Budish is the Stephen Rothmeyer Professor of Economics at Chicago Booth. Eric's main research area is market design, but he has worked more specifically on financial market, matching market, cryptocurrencies, and incentives for innovation. Today, he will present his paper, R less than 1 as an economic constraint. Can we expand the frontier in the fight against COVID-19? The second speaker will be Luigi Zingales. Luigi is the Robert McCormack Distinguished Professor of Entrepreneurship and Finance at Chicago Booth. He's also the faculty director of the Stigler Center. Luigi's research interests are very broad, as we know. They range from political economy to corporate finance to financial development and the economics of culture. He will be presenting his paper in progress, COVID-19 fatality rate. So before turning over to Eric, just give you a little bit of context. The two papers address the issue of, how do we move the frontier in the fight against COVID and how do we measure correctly the fatality rate? These are two absolutely critical questions. Just as a reminder, the Bank of England today, or yesterday rather, announced that they forecast a doubling of the unemployment and a 14% drop in output. The EU Commission, in its revised forecast, proposed a 7.5% drop in GDP in the EU, and that's including, policy response that's supposed to mute the effect. So that's about, as bad as it's going to be in terms of recessions. In terms of measuring what COVID is really doing, I can just give you one example, which is I wrote a paper, in fact, that I presented in this series. And in 1 month, based on current data, we've changed the parameters, the critical parameters in the model by a factor of 2. So a month ago, we had estimates of relatively low R0, so around 2.5, and relatively high fatality rates. And today, the new data that we're using suggests a much higher value of R0 and a relatively lower value of the fatality rate. Now, these are absolutely critical parameters for any decision you might take with respect to COVID. And so measuring this properly is extremely important. So I think that's enough motivation for these two papers. And I turn the floor over to Eric for the first paper. You have half an hour.
Thank you very much, Thomas. And thank you to Luigi and the Stigler Center. Thanks to all of you for the important work that you do. To manage expectations, what I'll present today is a short conceptual note as opposed to a full academic paper aimed at the refereed journals. I've been circulating it since April 1st, which, as Thomas just alluded to, seems like an eternity ago. It's just 5 weeks in calendar time, but feels a long time ago now. Some good news is 5 weeks on, there's been a lot more expand the frontier thinking, especially around masks and other relatively simple interventions that allow for more economic and social activity while reducing transmission risk. The bad news is the human suffering and lockdown has been rapidly accumulating. We still don't have a clear, convincing plan for how to get out, absent a treatment or vaccine or a massive increase in testing capacity. There are some promising signs, and I hope this will change soon. So this note makes two basic, I think quite simple points. So the first point is it might be useful to think of, and I'll underscore useful, to think of R less than 1, so the reproductive rate of the virus less than 1, as something like an economic constraint with traditional economic and social goals as the objective. This is a simple way to think about the dynamics of the problem we face and incorporate these dynamics into much more familiar and comfortable and portable static optimization. To be clear, I think a full-blown dynamic model is for PhD economists who speak that language more correct, but this is a lot simpler. And as such, it might be more portable for engaging with medical experts, for educating the public, and for interpreting policy ideas from non-economists. And this simple approach yields two very straightforward economic points. It yields a language with which to talk about economic trade-offs. So what activities maximize welfare subject to a constraint? We can think about trade-offs. And second, a language with which to talk about expanding what economists call the production possibilities frontier. In this case, how much social welfare can we achieve while keeping R less than 1? The second point is, as soon as you start thinking about the production possibilities frontier, it leaps out at you how urgently we need to figure out how to expand it. And as I've alluded, there's been a lot of progress on that front in the last month and a half. Lockdown and laissez-faire are both terrible choices. We need to find some kind of middle ground. In a lockdown, we've had 33 million Americans file for unemployment, widespread business distress, but ignoring the virus is also not a viable option because of the potential death toll. So the numbers are, as Thomas alluded, we're still trying to fix estimates of the mortality rate, but it could be on the order of millions of deaths. We need to find some kind of middle ground. At some risk of going over my skis, not being a medical expert, I'll go through an example of the kind of thinking I hope to encourage with this note. And to highlight how little we know, if you pose the question about whether some relatively simple interventions, I'll talk about things like wearing face masks, wearing gloves, more sophisticated public education campaigns regarding hand washing and not touching your face, that kind of thing. If you ask whether these kinds of relatively simple interventions could save the economy, meaning enable much more economic activity while keeping R less than 1, the answer is we don't yet know that. Medical experts don't know the answer to that question quite yet. There's been a lot of work, but we don't know. And in this lack of knowledge, we've shut down vast parts of the economy, and 30+ million people are unemployed. I'll touch on some of the progress, especially on masks, towards the end of this talk. So economists usually think about policy with a constrained optimization problem in the back of their heads, maximizing social welfare subject to the various constraints of the environment. And social welfare includes economic activity and various other dimensions of societal well-being, including health. There have now been about half a dozen serious economics papers, Thomas being one of the distinguished ones, doing some version of one in a dynamic model that incorporates health into the objective and thinks about disease dynamics carefully in the constraints. The health response to this crisis, especially in the early days of lockdown, has looked more like Formulation 2, where the objective is to minimize the spread of the virus, perhaps subject to some lower bound constraint of keeping society functioning, but essentially to minimize the spread of the disease at all costs. And so far, over the last couple of months, 2, not 1, has been the framework that's been guiding most policy decisions. And 2 implies total lockdown. What I suggest might be useful to consider, again, not fully correct. If economists rule the world, I think we'd do some sophisticated version of 1. But what might be useful to consider is program 3, where we maximize social welfare subject to the usual constraints of the economic environment, technology, incentives, and so forth, but incorporate R less than 1 as an additional constraint. So incorporate containing the spread of the virus as an additional constraint on the problem. And what this will achieve is it'll enable us to talk in using very simple static optimization language about some of the complicated dynamics at play. As is widely understood, so where does R less than 1 come from? As is widely understood, diseases with a reproduction rate greater than 1 eventually infect huge numbers of people until we reach herd immunity. Whereas diseases with R less than 1 eventually dissipate in the population, or by substantial time until we find a vaccine or successful treatment. So R less than 1 approximates, if you will, the health objective of minimize disease spread in formulation 2, while maintaining the right objective function, while maintaining social welfare as the goal, as in formulation 1. And as you'll see in a few slides, this formulation allows us to talk about the economics of the problem we face in a very simple and familiar way that I think allows us to focus on the essence of some of the big open questions, and rather than getting lost in, or rather than focusing on some of the more complex dynamics. And I should say parenthetically, my research area is market design, and approximation and thinking about non-standard constraints are tools that are relatively common in that area of economics. So why is R less than 1 important? And I'll spend a few slides explaining this formulation and making a few clarifications, and I'll get into what it implies. So first, let me illustrate very simply the sense in which R less than 1 is an important threshold in epidemiological models. This is very well known. What this figure illustrates is the cumulative number of infections over a 24-month period in a standard SIR epidemiology model, so susceptible, infected, recovered. There are more sophisticated models than this one, but this is kind of the off-the-shelf standard one. Each line represents a different initial number of infections that then grows over time. And the initial infection rate for this simulation, I use a range all the way down to 1,000 and all the way up to 10 million. And you can think of 1,000 as maybe a rough proxy for an intervention that started in February in the United States. Although again, the numbers are just, we still have so much data uncertainty. And 10 million you can think of as larger than most estimates for the number of infections in the US as of the present. Again, though, there's still uncertainty because our testing's been so bad. The horizontal axis varies the virus's reproductive rate, or R. More precisely, for those of you familiar with the SIR model, what I'm doing is holding fixed the gamma parameter and varying the beta parameter, so that beta over gamma equals the value depicted on the horizontal axis. The vertical axis then depicts the cumulative number of infections over the next 24 months absent a vaccine or treatment. So first look out to the right of the screen, so over here. And what you see is that if R is high enough, so think like 1.5, 2 or higher, then no matter what the initial infection seed is, we're gonna have at least 200 million infections. It doesn't really matter what the initial infection seed is because of the exponential growth in viruses if R is bigger than 1 by a meaningful amount. So now look all the way to the left, so this part of the figure, and you see that if R is low enough, then we pretty much stop the virus in its tracks, and there isn't growth beyond the initial infection seed. If you look right around R of 1, a little bit to the right of that, and you first focus on the bottom 4 lines, what you'll see is that R of about 1 is of course this critical threshold at which the number of cumulative infections really starts to take off. R greater than 1 leads to exponential growth, R less than 1 doesn't. And for the highest line with 10 million initial infections, that's this red here, R of 1 is still a critical threshold, but you'll see as well that R slightly below 1 still leads to a very large number of infections because we're starting from such a high base. And I'll come back to this in a few slides. Infections, of course, lead to deaths. Luigi will talk about what we do and don't know about the mortality rate. The range in the, let me not get into what the subject of Luigi's talk, but roughly speaking, the infection fatality rate's been estimated at about 0.5% or 1%, maybe a bit higher. In New York City, 0.2% or really 0.16% of the city has already died. So that kind of falsifies the hope that the infection fatality rate was dramatically lower than that. So let me make the case for R less than 1 in a very simple price theory graph. The blue line is the data you saw in the previous slide for the case of a seed of 1 million. But with the axis and the interpretation now reversed. The horizontal axis depicts lower R off to the right, so more mitigation. And the blue line depicts the benefits in terms of reduction, in terms of infections and mortality. Again, the same data, but I'm flipping the signs for both axes, where R out to the right is lower R, more mitigation, and vertical is now higher benefits of reducing the spread of the disease. The red line conceptually is the cost of mitigation. I'm depicting a standard economic convex cost function. What convex costs to convey is that for the first mitigation stuff you do is the easiest, then you do stuff that's a bit harder, and you do stuff that's a bit harder still. So costs get increasingly steep. And this line is completely illustrative. It's not, we don't have data on what this curve looks like. That's one of my points. But it is reasonable to note that the blue line has this S shape that's well known in epi models. And it's reasonable to postulate that this red line will have something like a convex cost shape. So what do you want to do given this nature of benefits and costs? And as depicted here, you want to make sure you get the benefits from the super steep part of the blue curve, which you enjoy from getting towards R of about 1. If the red line's much higher than is depicted, so if the economic costs of mitigating spread are substantially higher, then what do? You do nothing. You let the virus run its course. People will be careful in the ways that are essentially free. So they'll wash their hands a lot more, and they'll be cautious about going out, but not doing any more draconian social distancing if the red line is much, much higher. What's hard if you think about this diagram conceptually is it's hard to make a case for doing some mitigation, but not trying to go all the way towards R less than 1. I mean, R 1.1 is because if we get a vaccine in 12 months, that doesn't, it's worse, but it's not dramatically worse. There isn't quite enough time for the exponential growth to kick. But conceptually, what's hard to see a case for is doing some mitigation, but not really trying to get most of the benefits from this steepening of the blue line. So, I mean, the exception would be if getting to R of 1.5 was for some reason cheap, but getting to R of say 0.9 was infinitely costly. Then you'd want to do what you can. But for this reason, I think the flatten the curve graph that circulated extremely widely a couple months ago was conceptually flawed, because the flatten the curve idea was about spreading infections out over time, but not actually trying to reduce the spread of the virus. It was treating the capacity of the healthcare system as the binding constraint in the whole economy. Why go to here when you could go all the way to here and just prevent all of us from actually getting the thing? So make a couple additional notes on this formulation. So first of all, is R less than 1 technologically feasible? And in a word, the answer is yes. There's a lot of examples that have accumulated. South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong. There's been some encouraging data from US states that have put in significant social distancing. So New York City, for example. And some rough intuition, Thomas alluded to the uncertainty about these numbers. But if we think of the initial R naught as ballpark 3, which is what's been estimated early on by epidemiologists, and that's in a population that's unaware of the disease with no interventions. That's a population that doesn't even know to be careful about washing your hands, let alone a population where 40 million people are unemployed. We know now a lot about how the virus spreads. We don't know everything about it, but we know a lot. So it's not crazy to think that a 2/3 reduction of R or a 3/4 reduction of R if R naught's 4 is possible, both that as people become aware and endogenously change their behavior, and with policy interventions. Again, not easy, but not crazy. And the alternative is 40 million unemployed. Question 2 is R less than 1 significant enough? And if the current infected population's already very high, and you kind of saw this on the figure from a couple slides ago, then it might make sense in a richer dynamic model to have a period of R meaningfully less than 1, to first reduce the stock of infected, and then transition to R of around 1 as the constraint. And if you read the really quite remarkable Hammer in the Dance blog post from a couple months ago, or the AEI's roadmap to reopening that was put out about 1 month ago now, this dynamic strategy seems to be what these non-economist experts have in mind. And I think the language in my note might translate into economics language what these policy proposals are trying to express. My colleague Rob Scheimer, together with Miriam Ferbuti and Gregor Jarbush, has formalized this thinking in a dynamic macro model. Last is R less than 1 too much? I guess what I'd say here is my formulation's implicitly assuming that the mortality rate's high, and relatedly that the susceptible population is high. And if not, we're quite lucky. And R less than 1 might be too restrictive. And this relates to urgent research that Luigi will present next, and work by Atkinson and Stock, all trying to figure out, work by epidemiologists, trying to figure out what the mortality rate is, given the underlying infection fatality rate, just given the paucity of great data. And then similarly, if we could gain confidence that the mortality rate's sufficiently low for a sufficiently large subpopulation. So for example, if we learned with confidence that if you're below some age threshold and don't have one of a number of health comorbidities, that the mortality rate was extremely low, that might also imply dynamics that are different from R less than 1. It might imply a plan where we try to keep the elderly and or vulnerable at home, but open up the economy more meaningfully, more dramatically for those with low mortality risk. And this relates to recent work by Asimoglu and Chernozukov, Warning, and Winston at MIT. As soon as you put the problem this way, so this formulation of maximize social welfare subject to the usual constraints and this R less than 1 constraint, it becomes very simple to talk about 2 important economic ideas. So first of all, trade-offs. R less than 1 places a shadow cost on activities that increase disease transmission. And there's formal notation in the back of this research note for those for whom that's a useful tool. And in that notation, think of each activity I having a disease transmission cost risk, RI. So what's the risk of going to a coffee shop, or what's the risk of taking the subway? And there's an overall shadow cost, lambda, on activities that increase the transmission in society. So how should we think about policy? We should think about policies that encourage actions that have a high ratio of social welfare benefits to disease transmission costs, and that prohibit, or in some sense discourage or ban, actions that have a low ratio of social welfare benefits to disease transmissions costs. So this raises kind of an obvious policy question. What if we're trying to keep R less than 1, but create as much welfare as possible? What do we do? And this formulation makes it very natural to talk about essential activities, and also to do things like closing bars and banning large gatherings, which have very high RI. the essential activities you can think of as having very high VI relative to their RI. My colleagues, Kate Baker, Andrella Dubé, Sendel Mullинathan, and Devin Pope just put out a really nice analysis that quantifies something that's like RIs for different kinds of businesses using cell phone tracker data. So they don't quite get all the way to transmission, but they can get to, for different kinds of businesses, what's the likelihood of a close contact between two people for an extended period of time. And that's a decent proxy for RIs. The second point that comes out of this formulation is the urgency of expanding the PPF, the production possibilities frontier. Once we have this shadow cost of lambda on the R less than 1 constraint, and if the constraints are of less than 1.1, as Cuomo's been talking about, it's kind of the same economics. It leaps out how valuable it is to expand the PPF. And it becomes hard, frankly, to think about anything else given the mess we're in. Again, in the formal notation, the shadow cost is lambda. And given the mess we're in, this lambda is likely enormous. So the obvious policy question is, are there technologies that increase how much economic activity and societal well-being we can achieve while keeping R less than 1? Okay, so this is where I'm going to go at some risk of going out over my skis, but I want to give an example of the kind of thinking that I have in mind and that I've been trying to encourage with this modest note about expanding the frontier. Again, the obvious caveats, not a medical expert, the science is rapidly evolving. So please, I know I could criticize myself, please don't shoot me, I'm doing what I can. So we know a fair amount about how the virus spreads. It spreads primarily through droplets from an infected person. So think of a cough or a sneeze, or a very loud vocal expression, so singing or shouting. A susceptible person touching a surface contaminated by an infected person. So think an infected coughing on a surface that a susceptible then touches their face. Close personal contact between an infected and susceptible for non-trivial duration. Atul Gawande emphasizes that the threshold is not epsilon contact, but more like 15 or 30 minutes of unprotected close contact. So not passing someone in the street, but spending time in a closed environment with someone who's infected but may not know it. And then, as I just alluded to, one of the real difficulties with containing the spread is that asymptomatics can spread without knowing they're infected. I would refer you all to a delightful Jerry Seinfeld joke about this, about how polio would be very jealous of how coronavirus figured out to go undetected for so long. Masks and gloves. So the title of this slide helps in a few ways. So infecteds are less likely to spread the virus if they're wearing a mask. Everybody's hands are less likely to hold on to virus if they're wearing gloves. And masks might also help susceptibles not get infected by someone who coughs or expels virus, sheds virus in the air near them. So given this understanding of how the virus spreads, hypothetically suppose, again, underscore hypothetically, that some variation in the following set of policies could reduce R by the necessary 2/3, or the necessary 3/4. Not to 0, but from the neighborhood of 3-ish to the neighborhood of 1-ish. So one, widespread public education campaign. So not just stay home, stay safe, which is the language of lockdown. It's a language of don't leave your house, but wash your hands, don't touch your face, keep your distance where possible. Really educating what kinds of activities are risky and where the risk is and where the risk isn't. Second, mandatory quarantines for anybody with virus symptoms, so fever, persistent cough, enforced with carrots and sticks. A severe fine if you're out in public with a fever or persistent cough. Compensation if you stay out of harm's way. Mandatory use of masks in many situations outside the home. So context where it's unavoidable to come within 6 feet of others for non-trivial duration of time. gloves in many situations outside the home. So all contexts where it's unavoidable to touch surfaces that strangers also touch. So if you're riding the New York City subway, gloves might be a sensible thing to mandate. If these kinds of policies could together reduce R less than 1, then we could have a mostly functioning economy and society. This stuff is not free, but it's also a lot cheaper than lockdown. And there's an if and a then here. Like, I understand the contingency. The fact is we don't quite know what's enough to get R less than 1. And in the absence of that knowledge, we've gone into extremely expensive total lockdown mode. So my point, of course, is not this specific list of policies. Again, I'm not a medical expert. My point's that the urgent priority should be figuring out whether some combination of these kinds of policies can succeed. Some of these seem like free lunches. So public education seems like a free lunch here. Other kinds of interventions, while not costless, seem really cheap relative to shutting the economy down. So masks, gloves, isolation, testing's important as a complement to isolating the infected. So we need to get creative about ways to bring R less than 1 without an indefinite period of severe shutdown. This is just a major gap in our empirical understanding. If R naught were on the order of 10, this would seem more daunting. But if R naught's on the order of 3, or Thomas alluded to the uncertainty, we have a relatively clear understanding of how the disease spreads. We have several empirical examples to date of countries managing R less than 1. It just doesn't, it seems achievable. And my sincere hope out of this research is that it's one small, very small piece of just encouraging medical experts and economists to engineer creative ways to reduce R and get us back to some normalcy. I'll make a couple of last points that I hope can come up in the discussion, and then I'll wrap. So first, the idea of mass testing put out by Paul Romer and many others, I think it's really smart. I hope we can do it. Conceptually, mass testing is a technology that expands the frontier. It allows significantly more economic and societal activity while containing R less than 1, because it's kind of precisely, it's like a precisely targeted mask. It precisely protects those who are infected but don't yet know it from going out and infecting others. That said, we need not let the perfect be the enemy of the good here. I mean, I would like to get up to Romer scale testing. I think his arguments about the need to be creative and you know, how much resources we spend on producing Coca-Cola. I love that stuff. I hope we can do it. In the meanwhile, we should do testing to the extent we can, because it's also a way to reduce R, even if we're not yet at Romer's scale. Second is masks. So the evidence in support of the use of face masks seems to be accumulating. There's a nice paper out of Yale by Jason Abeluk and several others, economists, epidemiologists, very interdisciplinary group. Another paper that I've cited by Howard et al. That can conceptually too, masks are also an expand the frontier technology. It allows significantly more economic and societal activity while containing R, while keeping R less than 1. In the city of Chicago, we recently mandated that if you're out of the house and can't keep distance, you've got to wear masks. I got my 6-year-old, you know, wearing a mask. But that's smart given the nature of this virus. And then last but not least are just the data gaps. And this Luigi will talk about this fundamental issue. It's frustrating 2 months into lockdown how much we still don't know. We still don't know the true mortality rate. We still don't know the heterogeneity in that mortality rate across age groups and medical vulnerabilities. We don't know nothing, but we could stand to know a lot more given the trillions of dollars and millions of lives at stake. The effects of various kinds of interventions on reducing R. Is a 65% reduction in R easy or hard? It sounds easy relative to the cost of the alternative, but we don't yet know And last, the role of super spreaders and non-compliers. I mean, one of the fears I have is that we're going to have a situation over many, many months where we have some subsets of the population with R not just less than 1, but significantly less than 1. While at the same time, there are other subsets of the population with R enough bigger than 1 that on average, it kind of nets to growth in infections, and politicians keep us on pretty severe lockdown, don't let kids go back to school. That just doesn't seem like optimal policy. We need better data and understanding to know the path from here. Thank you again for your attention, and I'll look forward to Luigi's talk and to the discussion.
Thank you, Eric. So now we're going to have Luigi Zingales, who's going to present his working in progress on measuring the true parameters and the true fatality of COVID.
Okay, so first of all, thank you. And Eric gave the perfect introduction also to what I want to say. Preamble, this is joint work with Pietro Amella, who is a research professional at the Stigler Center here at the University of Chicago. And I think that the motivation is quickly said, because it's exactly what Eric was saying, that 4 months into this pandemic, we're still struggling with a lot of information that is crucial to policymaking. But in particular, we're struggling to find out what the infection fatality rate is. That just to put everybody on the same page, this is simply number of deaths over number of infected. And of course, as you can imagine, the number of infected is massively under-detected. In a sense, my daughter is almost sure got COVID in Paris. She never got tested. Pietro's parents both got COVID in Italy. The father got tested because he's a doctor. The mother did not get tested, but she got it from the father, and she's pretty sure she has COVID. So then even casual pieces suggest that the number of infected is massively underestimated. And then there's a question whether we estimate the death properly, and I'm going to come back to that. But that's the problem, and that's the reason why we have estimates that go from 0.1% in Iceland to 4.5% in Wuhan. And then, of course, when you have this order of magnitude of difference, I think that the policy is completely paralyzed, because making a mistake can be gigantic. And I think that this is clearly important in thinking about the cost of different strategy. And there is also a one-to-one mapping between how, because at least we know the order of magnitude of death. I discussed that we might underestimate that, but we know the order of magnitude of death. We don't even know the order of magnitude of infected, okay? And so the infection fatality rate could determine also how many infected are out there. And if the infection fatality rate is very low, given the number of deaths we have, means that the number of infected is very large. So we are very close to herd immunity, and it would be sort of ironic if we lock us down just before herd immunity. And I think that finding this out is difficult. And now, why it's so difficult? Number one, not only there is a misreporting in the data, but you have to realize that there is a massive instability in parameters. There is instability in parameter in terms of age. Older people die more often than young of the disease. I will show some data. Location, social custom, all this stuff has a massive impact. In addition, as Eric said, as the disease gets recognized, even before you have some formal lockdown by the government, you have a lot of ordinary measures taken by people that impact the spread of the disease. As I said, we have bad data on the number of infections. The problem is not just that the level is off, because if it was only a problem of level, then we can, as I will show, we can deal with that very easily. The problem is that that underreporting might be very highly correlated with the spread of the disease. When nobody knows about the disease, is massively underreported, then people get alerted, then they start testing like crazy. That underreporting goes down for a little while. Then people are overwhelmed by the disease, and unless you're dying, they don't test you because they're not going to do anything. And so the underreporting goes up again. even official death data can be biased downward, and I will discuss this. And then to add it, to insult to injury, there is a quasi-observational equivalence that Andy Atkinson has emphasized between a situation with high infection and low fatality and a situation with low infection and high fatality. And of course, the world is dramatically different from a policy point of view in one of the two scenarios, but which is hard to tell. So our goal here is to use a combination of theory and data to get to the best possible estimates, exploiting three unique features of the Italian data. The first one is that unfortunately, Italy was at the forefront of this epidemic with a lot of outbreaks. Second, in a surprise fashion, in a sense, they release very broad daily data on abnormal death by age cohort and gender. And that's quite unique. And of course, there is plenty of geographic variation in the intensity of the disease and also in the availability of the ICU units. So most people are familiar with this model at this point, but just some parameters that are important to discuss. So we use a standard workhorse in epidemiology, which is the susceptible, infected, resistant model. So basically, people who are infected spread the disease at a rate that is characterized by beta. And so they transition from susceptible to infected. They die or recover at the rate gamma, and then they become resistant. And just like everybody else, we accept the gamma that is in the literature and tends to be around 0.1 because it takes 10 days to die after you have the first symptoms of the disease, condition on dying. So we take, and this is estimated in clinical studies. And one of the question is beta, and of course, one of the question is the fatality rate. Now, notice that here, this model works without any assumption of the fatality. So you need to add an equation, and you say that the number of deaths is equal to nu times the resistant. So a fraction of the people who transition between infected and to resistant die, and the rest becomes really resistant. And there is a technical issue that is not particularly important, that nu is going to be the ratio between the dead and the total positive only as t goes to infinity, because as the infection spreads, even if you were to measure the infected properly, that ratio will not be nu. Now, there are two assumptions that we're going to hold up in throughout. The first one, which is crucial not only for our model but to our long-term survival, is that infection leads at least temporary immunity. If that is not true, not only this model does not apply, but we are screwed big time. The second, I already mentioned that gamma is equal to 0.1. That's easy to fix. And people have often heard the term R naught. R naught is simply how much you spread the disease at the beginning before you have any spreading of the disease, and is in this model is just beta over gamma. Okay? Now, notice that most people tend to estimate the spread of the disease using infection data. And infection data not only are biased in level, there's bias in also in variation. What we realize, and I'm sure somebody else had discovered that, but either I did not find a proper citation, so if you send me the citation, I'm happy. What we found is that you can write actually the growth rate in infection in terms just of dead people, assuming a constant fatality rate. So here what we show using the definition of the CM model equation 3 is that you can write the rate of growth of the infected as a function of the resistant. Now that's not particularly useful because we don't mention we don't see the resistant, but to the extent that the resistant are just a proportion, a fixed proportion of nu, then you can see that in the rate of change, nu cancel out. And so the acceleration in the number of deaths is equal to the rate of growth in infected. And so you can try to estimate this. Now notice at the beginning of the disease, the growth rate is just beta minus gamma. Over time, as I will explain later, it might change. Okay, so that's what we started to do with a Kalman filter, and with estimated a beta in the core of the infection in Italy, which is the two regions of Lombardia and Emilia. And what we have done here, we've given, here are not periods, there are a number of different sources, because we use aggregate, local, provincial sources of the number of deaths, trying to get to the proper beta. And you get a beta that is slightly above actually 4, which is more than most people have found. Now, you're nervous about relying everything on one measure. And then what you see is that, in fact, in a model like this, everything trends roughly at the same pace. So if you look at if you trust more the number of IC, of patients in IC units, what you can find out is that the variation over time, imagine that the fraction phi goes into, of the infected goes into IC units, the rate of growth of IC patients is, the phi cancel is equal to beta minus gamma. So we can estimate the same thing, and we get to, surprisingly, a very close number in terms of roughly between 0.4 and 0.45 in terms of the growth of beta. If you were to use with the infection, number of infected, actually this number tend to be higher. So, but we don't trust this number very much, and so we dump it. So I will explain in a second the very phases of the Italian disease, but we repeat this exercise over 3 periods before the first lockdown order that took place the 8th of March. And as I said, if we start to trim, and this is what we have learned, if you start to trim some outliers, the numbers becomes a little bit more reasonable. So this is before the first lockdown. This is, this is after the first lockdown. And you see that the number goes down to close to 2. And then this is after the second lockdown, the number is below 1.5. Now, if you have just listened to the talk by Eric, this corresponds to a rho of roughly 0.5, because you take out gamma, which is 0.1, and you divide by gamma, so you have roughly a 0.5 rho, which is what you want if you want the disease to go down. Now, once you get the beta calculated properly, you can try to do some simulation on how widespread the disease is, for example, in Lombardia. And what we know is that the first deaths that were observed, that these are official deaths, are as of the 25th of February. And there were roughly 9 deaths in Lombardia the 25th of February. And the other thing we know is that apparently, looking at some genetic mutation, they determined that the first virus was introduced roughly the 20th or 25th of January. So if you assume there was one patient, and the story goes was a patient, actually a German, who visited, was asymptomatic, came to Italy, and might have started the disease. And this German had met a guy from Wuhan. That's the story. Then what you will expect if the rate of spread of the beta is 0.4, then 35 days before February 25, you have the first patient. You will have 9,000 infected in Lombardia. That corresponds to 0.1%. And using the prediction of the values time of beta, you're going to have that as of April 4th, and I will explain why April 4th, because a lot of our data end at that time, you're going to have 8% of infected in Lombardia. Now, as you can imagine, this is extremely sensitive to the beta and to when the disease starts. So if instead of having initial beta of 0.4, you have a beta of 0.44, then you see the virus hypothesis you end up with not 8% of the infected April 4th, but 30% of the infected in April 4th. And if you think that the disease has spread 5 days earlier, you have a massive amount of difference. Now, you hope to solve this with a death, but you don't. So here I simulate just for the beta 0.4, and I give you different nu. And again, that's the order of magnitude of the death. Remember, the order of magnitude of the death in Lombardia in February 25th was 9. So this is mostly compatible, if the beta is 0.4, is mostly compatible with infection fatality rate of 0.5%. However, if you run this to April 4th, you get only 4,000 deaths in Lombardia in April 4th. And in April 4th, the official deaths in Lombardia were 8,000 and change. So a little bit more compatible with a nu of 1%. Now, the problem that we have, and this is a simulation of the growth rate of infected, is that if you start with a very high level of infected, which is compatible only given the number of deaths with a very low infection rate, then you are in the curve, in the blue curve, where at some point, 15 days into this model, you should see a dramatic slowdown of the growth rate due to the fact that the number of susceptibles start to go down, and so the disease, you're not at herd immunity, but you're approaching herd immunity. Now, the problem is that roughly around age day 15 from the spreading of the disease, or from the moment we started, you have the order of lockdown, so separating the effect of lockdown from the effect of herd immunity. We have tried in many different ways, but the results are not particularly satisfactory. So that's the reason, and this is the information about the Italian case, and this is the picture of where the thing is concentrated. That's the reason why we resorted to try to look at the age about abnormal death. So abnormal death are simply the death that takes place during that period, minus the death that were taking place the same period the last 5 years. As you can see, especially in Lombardia, especially after the middle of February, you see a growth in the number of abnormal deaths that is pretty dramatic. Now, let me give you an example. This is not a random example, and I will explain the importance of this. But now I give you the example of how I calculate the abnormal number of deaths and how massive this is in some towns. This is a town near Bergamo that makes 10,000 people. And as you can see, in the cohort up to age 50 included, so basically up to age 60, you have 0 or even negative abnormal death. So people up to 55 die in number this year less than they died last year. Then you start going up, and you see that, for example, during the period that goes from February 15 to April 4th, last year there was half of a person in the 60 cohort that died, almost one person in the 70 cohort, and 22 people in the 80 and above cohort. This year, you had 3 people in the 60 cohort, 11 in the 70, and 154 in the above 80 cohort, for a total number of difference in death of 131 people. Now, if you divide by the population in that cohort, this is 33%. So 33% of people above 80 died, while 0% below 60, basically. And between 60 and 70 is 0.2%, and in the 70 range is 1%. Now, of course, this is an extreme, but I think that you need to keep this number in mind. Now, there are a couple of issues about abnormal death. The first one is do we trust official death or abnormal death? So here I have, for a cross-section of towns in Lombardia, I have the number of deaths per 1,000 inhabitants. On the x-axis, these are the official death, and on the y-axis are the cumulative abnormal death as of April 4th, 2020. What you see is not surprising, the two measures are very highly correlated. What is interesting is that the slope is way above 1, is actually here is 1.8. So it seems that official death underestimates real death almost by a factor of 2, not exactly by a factor of 2. Now, there is a little bit of a philosophical question about which one is the right measure, because in some sense, abnormal death is the right measure, because imagine that in the town of Nembro, one of the people above 80 was a terminal cancer patient. He would have died anyway if the day before he got COVID, and he's classified as a COVID death, is the wrong classification, because he did not die because of COVID. And the abnormal number takes into consideration. The second is, if I am somebody above 80 and I have a heart attack in the city of Nembro, the ambulance probably does not arrive in time because they're overwhelmed, and that's part of the healthcare system. They're overwhelmed with all the COVID patients. So I die. I don't die because of COVID directly. I die because of the problem of the healthcare system. So I think that keep this number in mind when we're going to analyze this. So first, I want to give you the official death in Lombardia divided by the number of people in each cohort. And what you can see is in Lombardia, where at that time, the total number of deaths is roughly 10,000. You have that almost 60% of those deaths are for people above 80. Another sort of 35% is people in their 70s, and people in their 50s and 60s, or up to the late 50s, count for almost nothing. People up to 49, they count for 1% of the death when they represent 55% of the population. Okay, so what I put there, the last column, I have the population fatality rate. The population fatality rate multiplied by, this is not in percentages, it's per 1,000. So if you want percentage, divide by 10. So basically 1.5% of the people above 80 die in Lombardia by the April 27, and less than 0.003% of the people up to 50 die. So there is a huge difference in this. If you look at the abnormal death, is even worse. The abnormal death, as I told you, in Lombardia, and the first is the mean, the other is the median, and then the last is number of observations. So focus on the first two columns. The up to age 50, no abnormal death in Lombardia. In age in the 50s, a little bit. You start in the 60s, in the 70s start to be, this is again per 1,000, so 0.1%. In the 80s is 7%. And if you think the previous to the last column is the max, if you think that the mistake is the town I described earlier, Nembro, where 33% of the elderly pass away. Okay, so now this is interesting. So what we did is number of deaths is basically a count variable. So we can use the abnormal death with the binomial model, where I can put location fixed effect, and then cohort fixed effect, and then of course the frequency of the cohort, and then I put some dummy for some location. Now, if you're familiar with the negative binomial, this stuff should be read as a proportion. So where the offset is the category between 70 and 80. Why did I use that category? Because it's the category where we have the best evidence in a basically isolated sample, which is the Diamond Princess. Most of the people in the Diamond Princess were between 60 and 70. And between 70 and 80, not between 70 and 80, that's amazing. Most of them were between 70 and 80, and they die, the infection fatality rate for those people, and there is no measurement error there, is 2.6%. So if you want, you can think about all these numbers, multiply by 2.6% to get the real fatality rate. So as you see, for people below 50 is trivial. Even for people in the between 50 and 60s is roughly would be 0.3% if you multiply. 60 to 70 is half of what it is in the 70 to 80, so it would be 1.3, and the above 80 is a massacre. Now notice that I actually interacted those categories for the town, for this region of Lombardia, because Lombardia is the region where we have seen some true capacity constraint in hospitals. Okay, and not surprisingly, this is saying that, that we have the number of 2 times. So people in their 80s die of COVID-19 twice as much as everywhere else in Italy. Okay, so the fatality rate can increase massively, at least in that category, for healthcare shortage. People in their 60 to 70, they don't seem to be affected very much. This is not statistically significant. So are the other categories. So basically, where you see the massive impact is in the in people above 80. That's not true for every region. Look at Emilia. Emilia may be 30% more, but not the significantly more, or slightly significant, 5%, 6% level. Okay, so that's a quite important consideration. Now, what I would like to interpret is this coefficient of the Dami Lombardia for probability. Of course, these are the offset with respect to, so the number of times with respect to the offset. So this is saying that the infection in Lombardia was 8 times more than what it was in the rest of Italy, in the rest of northern Italy. All this stuff has been limited to northern Italy. So basically, what the bottom line of this is we see a massive amount of death in the older cohorts, much less so in the younger cohorts. And this is where I want to end with a question for you, because one of the ideas we had is, why don't we use some triangulation? Because we know that the population fatality rate is nothing else than the probability of being infected multiplied by the probability of dying conditionally infected. Now, of course, we don't know what the probability of dying conditionally infected is. This is our infection fatality rate that we would love to have. However, we know we can decompose that number in the probability of being tested given you are infected, and the probability of dying given you're tested. Why do we do this decomposition? Because the probability of dying given tested is an observable object, which is what is called in jargon the case fatality rate. So we have number for Lombardia on the case fatality rate, for example. And so we don't know much about what PT condition I is about, but being a probability, we know that it's below, or at least at best equal to 1. We know it's strictly less than 1. So if we take this approximation, we know that the probability of infection is bounded below by the ratio between the population fatality rate and the case fatality rate. And so you take the population fatality rate of Lombardia, and you take the case fatality rate, and you have a lower bound on infection rate. Now, we want to do something even more and say, wait a minute, we actually, we know this across cohorts. So if we are willing to take some assumption that the probability of infection is the same across cohort, we can triangulate that across cohort. To end, this is what we're doing with, these are done with official data, but imagine that we use what I told you earlier, we use the 2.6% infection fatality rate for the cohort in the 70s. And then we use the ratio that we calculated with the, either with this or with the binomial. Then we multiply by the frequency of the various classes. What we end up is a estimated average fatality rate of 0.6%. But that's kind of an estimation. The point I want you to take home tonight is not really the 0.6%. The word is how different this stuff is, okay? Because if this is really the case, then the question is, why are we shutting down the economy? We should shut down old people. And I belong to this category of older people, so I can say without fear of being accused of something. Anyway, two questions I have is, number one, to what extent we can do this triangulation, in the sense, if I take, remember the city of Nembro, the city of Nembro, we have that 33% of the old people die. So it's hard to imagine that you have kind of less than 100% of the infected, because if the infected were even less than that, means that the infection fatality rate in that cohort is above 33%, which is hard to imagine. Now, of course, there might be some outliers. In particular, there are some horror stories in Italy of the virus entering some retirement homes and killing a lot of people. So maybe the assumption of equal infection across age cohort is not tenable. But if we don't have that, I'm not so sure how much we can expand that. So concluding, I think there is some value in applying our methods to the epidemiological model. These numbers are really crucial to determine the economic policy. The thing that is surprising, at least after spending some time doing that, is how difficult it is to pin down this number precisely. And part of the story we learned recently is because of a gigantic variability across age cohort, and probably there is a similar variability about the preconditions. I don't know to what extent the low fatality rate among younger people that we experience in Italy can be extrapolated to the United States, because diabetes is very rare among young Italians. Unfortunately, it's very common among young Americans, especially in the Black community. So I think that there are, of course, some important caveats in transferring data across places, because the initial conditions are very different. Thank you.